Hi. I'm going to say a few things about political discourse in societies that are now called post-digital. Post-digital basically refers to the fact that the digital infrastructures have in many ways become social structures for the moment, so they've been fully incorporated in the structure of societies and in everyday life of the participants in those societies. Now, I think the topic is inevitable in the sense that all of us who are involved in the study of let's say, political discourse have, of course, over the past number of years been surprised or forced to look at a number of phenomena. For instance, the election of Donald Trump in the United States, but also Brexit in the UK and a number of other developments across the world. And so the point of departure that I'm going to use here is that we really need to start from an entirely new imagination of what society is, which is the post-digital society, right? In which we now know that media have become hybrid. So we now speak about the hybrid media system, meaning a layered and fractured system in which we have mass media in the traditional sense of the word, but also new media, social media, and that they interact in very particular ways. So there is a real synergy between these two. A lot of what we see on mass media has been drawn from social media and vice versa. So you see a very intricate sort of relationship with respect to the way in which messages, circulate and so on and so on. Now, in my view, and here's the point of departure, basically the backdrop to what I will say, is that all of this now means that we really need to look at infrastructures as a very, very important aspect of political discourse analysis. It means, for instance, that we can no longer be satisfied by looking at what politicians say, but at how these messages are effectively transmitted and also dispersed and also disseminated, by these new infrastructures that are very typical for the new types of societies that I described. Okay, so we need to abandon a number of assumptions, and in what follows I will outline basically three main elements of what I would suggest as a new vision for addressing political discourse nowadays. The first point is a very broad one and a very general one. It has to do with the fact that we need to abandon the traditional propaganda models of political communication. The most well-known of these propaganda models, of course, is Herman's and Chomsky's propaganda model. And in these propaganda models, there was a sort of very simple idea which is based on a traditional imagination of democracy as consisting of A, the state, B, the people, and in between them, 3, civil society. And in civil society you had mass media, all right? And in these propaganda models, mass media were basically seen as the propaganda machine, in the sense that it would always transmit the messages, the interests, the articulations of the ruling class towards the masses, let's say, to the people, right? Now, all of this, I think, is a modernist imagination, or at least it rests upon a modernist imagination of the public sphere, which is imagined as the masses, right? The public sphere looks homogeneous or unified. Most people would, deny this, but at the same time use it effectively in that particular sense as a homogenized, more or less uniform range of masses, okay? And well, here we have this very traditional, very modernist imagination of democracy as a sort of structured relation between the different components that I outlined, with mass media being absolutely central there. And if you go through the literature of the 20th century, you would see that numerous people all through the 20th century have reflected on the important, the critical role of mass media in a democracy, right? As exactly, within the propaganda model, an instrument that would relay the messages from the rulers, from the dominant classes to the masses. Just to name a few, there's Paul Lazarsfeld, there's Adorno, of course, there's Habermas, but also Giddens and even Dewey and so on and so on. So very, very broad literature on these issues. that and you know, in that literature, especially this idea of mass media as an essential transmission system within a democratic society was challenged, was developed as well, was also theorized, was also imagined in the way that we now call the propaganda model. So there's a very broad literature on this, and I think it's highly it's highly problematic, because what we now see in the context of, for instance, the election of Mr. Trump, or Brexit, or a number of other developments, I think of Bolsonaro in Brazil, is there's been a shift, you know, in the way in which political messages have been articulated, have been, let's say, disseminated in societies, from this transmission idea to what we now know as micro-marketing. All right? And in micro-marketing, we no longer have this unified public sphere. So the masses actually are chopped up into very, very small niche audiences, all right, very often of highly divergent nature. So the interests of one micro audience may clash fundamentally with the interest of another, right? But through through niche marketing, micro marketing, we are now able to address these different constituencies, the different audiences, and make a broad coalition out of them. And I think that's what we've seen in the context of the election of Mr. Trump, and so on. So in every example of new political discourse that we have been looking at, we see exactly that. It's micro marketing. Now these audiences, these niche audiences, are not enduring, so they can be very, very, very temporal. All right, they're very strongly issue focused as well. So one issue groups. All right, and also highly dynamic and unstable. They might be important now, but basically, you know, cease to exist next week. So we see very, very, very ephemeral sorts of groups, but they're real groups, and they can be mobilized by political discourse, and they can be made into coalitions that are weird, that are also not enduring. So they have the features of the particular audiences there, but still, you know, they win elections. Now we also know that in the context of micro-marketing, it is marketing, so it means, you know, that messages are being sold, if you wish, are being offered to the audiences in a highly aesthetic form, all right, in a highly irrational form as well, in emotive, or at least in messages that emphasize the emotive, but are at the same time also epistemic. And so what we see is that things like fake news, all right, or hoaxes, or say conspiracy theories, are evidently irrational, all right, but at the same time they are epistemic in the sense that they provide a sense of logic, if you wish, a sense of rationality to those who subscribe to them. And so we see also that the nature of the messages is changing significantly, and the entire sociological frame within which the messages are articulated and also distributed has also changed. Now this has a number of implications. The first very important, let's say, implication that I see is we have to abandon the modernist idea of democracy as a rational system of decision making, a rational system of decision making. So involving issues of the truth. So the truth is no longer the big ammunition, so to speak, or the heavy artillery of a democracy. It's the battle over truth. And, you know, with alternative facts and fake news, etc., etc., it's about the construction of narratives, a lot more than the construction of hard facts. And so we need to abandon this imagination that we had for a long time, that democracy is based on rational dialogue, you know, between leaders and constituencies. I don't think that is no longer say valid. A second implication, but strongly attached to that, is that we also need to abandon this idea of a modern democracy as being driven or as being grounded in relatively stable majorities and minorities. All right, what we now see is no, the political process is driven no longer by stable majorities that could be sociologically described in terms of social class, gender, and what have you. No, it is driven by flexible groups in broad coalitions that can be highly ephemeral. This old idea that majority groups and minority groups are engaged, non-stop engaged in rational debate over what has to be done in the way of political decision making, again, of course, is victim to these new developments, I think. That also means that we have to abandon, and here's a third, let's say, implication, but a footnote, which is, of course, evident. We need to abandon the idea of public opinion, because where's the public now? So the public no longer exists in the form that grounded methodology for public opinion. So these are implications. And altogether, I believe that they invite or demand an entirely new sociology for imagining the way in which contemporary politics, works and is developed and so on. So we need to create a new footing, a sociological footing for what it is that we do. So this is my first point, the end of the propaganda models, and you see that it has very serious repercussions on how we imagine politics, how we imagine society, how we imagine also political participation, and so on. But I think it's inevitable. Brings me to a second point. And the second point is we need to develop or work with an entirely new model of communication. So if we go back now to the propaganda model, you would see that, and again, here is modernism, but you would see that the model of communication is linear. And so you have a sender, the politician, for instance, and you have a receiver, the electorate, or the political constituency, right? I don't think that works anymore. And here I can refer to a very interesting notion that has been developed by my friend and good colleague Iko Mali, the notion of algorithmic populism. And he describes that as a new set of relationships. So it's not about content, it's about relationships between the politician and the public. All right, a sender and a receiver, but all of them enveloped in an entirely new type of relationship. Okay, and this relationship bears no resemblance to the traditional modes of dyadic sort of interaction that we have been using in our communication theories over and over again, all through the 20th century. It's vastly more complex. If we take the example of Twitter, for instance, and we look at what happens to a tweet, for instance, a tweet by Mr. Trump, we see, yes, indeed, there is a sender, Mr. Trump, and when he tweets, he addresses an audience, but in reality, all right, the receiver of the tweet is an algorithm. It is a Twitter algorithm, all right? And through this algorithm, the tweet is disseminated through individuals as well as bots, all right? Because not all the responses are done by individuals. Many of them are done by computer programs that automatically generate responses, retweets, and what have you, all right? And these responses from the audiences, and they are, of course, multiple, so here I need to go back to the earlier observations that I made, but these responses are again immediately transformed by the algorithm into new messages that can be brought to new audiences. Again, like, primary audiences and secondary audiences. And it is this highly complicated new form of communication that explains virality. And here, I define virality here as the fact that messages are ultimately reaching audiences that were not intended, very large audiences. So there is a sort of multiplication effect, but all of it is algorithmic, right? So it is created by machines, if you wish. And we need to keep that in mind, because there is no way in which you can extract the algorithm from what goes on in the field of communication. You really, really need to take it seriously. Here's the observation that I made at the very outset about the importance of infrastructures. So we need to begin to look at the role of these machines in a new model of communication. In the field of political, discourse, it means that there's a range of implications, but one of the implications is that a lot of political discourse is not produced any longer by politicians. It may be started by politicians, but when you look at the actual modes of communication, the ways in which these messages, circulate, most of the producers, if you wish, of political discourse are not politicians, but are machines on the one hand and audiences. And then here again, is a challenge to our established idea of political communication as involving a very simple sort of relationship in which the sender is always the politician. Well, what we observe now is no, very often the sender is not a politician, but is either a machine or members of the audience, who in turn, create other interlocutors who might also be the producers of new political discourses, right? But at the same time, so the first thing I said in the way of implications is we have to abandon this old model of political rhetoric, or say interaction, in which the politician is the only sort of say the sender of the message. But the second implication is we see that this old image, right, is ideologically still exploited. So what we see is, in reality, most political discourse is no longer, let's say, circulated by politicians, but the idea that it is politicians in a sort of direct linear relationship with the audience is strongly maintained, right? Which is why, and here's the word populism, increasingly you have politicians who say, I'm merely saying what you guys are thinking. So I'm a real Democrat in the sense, that I speak for you. And then, for instance, the number of retweets, the level of virality of tweets, for instance, is an important argument. And then secondly, also, I'm very big on Twitter or on other social media. As a consequence, I have a democratic basis in the masses. And so you see a weird sort of relationship between a reality and a set of ideas about reality that are basically mutually exclusive, are really fundamentally paradoxical, but at the same time are very powerful and are articulated over and over and over again. And so here, I think the big implication of all of this is, in addition to the new sociology that we need to come up with in order to understand the new forms of political discourse, we also need a new footing in an entirely different sort of idea of communication, notably political communication, in which all of these changes can be incorporated and accounted for. And so we not only need a new sociology, we also need a new model of communicative action. Very sorry for Mr. Habermas, that we have to say that. Now, when we imagine that new form of communication, and here's my third and final point, there's a very important notion that I think is vital in understanding it, and that's the notion of the polycentric forms of communication. All right. One of the things that logically flows from this idea that the public sphere has been fragmented and has now been split into numerous very small audiences who might be mobilized on the basis of very, very different messages. All right. A logical, or at least a logical implication of that is that we are looking at multiple norms for political communication. And so this idea that, for instance, Obama's communication is automatically and universally good in terms of, the rhetorical quality of what he says, the content of what he says, and so on and so on, we have to abandon it. These different audiences all use very, very different normative systems, okay, which explains why things that from one, or at least from the perspective of one audience, might be seen as gaffes and as errors and as indicators, indexical indicators, or for instance, low levels of intelligence, all right, or an absence of schooling, etc., etc., or very poor manners might be perceived by a number of audiences as very good. So here you begin to see how the indexical orders are being reshuffled according to the particular audience that has been addressed, by a number of messages. In the case of Trump, we see that his writing, for instance, on Twitter has been systematically attacked. So he writes in a weird way, in the sense, there are all sorts of errors at all levels, orthographic but also discursive. It's very weird communication, and it has been under fire since day one from a sort of highly educated, artistic and intellectual elite. Okay, so in their view, these errors are wrong and are very strong indexes of a particular level of, let's say, intelligence. All right, and also fitness to be a president by extension of that. But for other audiences, exactly these errors are good stuff, in the sense that it's the way in which we also communicate. We also have difficulties with, orthographic adequacy and so on. So he's like us. And so here you begin to see how these different audiences have to be addressed by means of very, very different, say, bundles of norms. All right. And an extension or an implication of that is, of course, that all sorts of things that look like mistakes or, gaffes and so on in the field of political communication might be bad for some, but very good for others. And then here again, when we do an analysis, we need to keep that in mind. We need to keep in mind, that what looks like very wrong communication might be very right communication for particular subgroups, and vice versa. The enormous eloquence of Obama may of course be praised from a particular viewpoint, but would be in the eyes of other audiences the evidence of the fact that he's not like us, that he's a member of the elite. Right? So we need to keep that in mind. We need to keep in mind that the same message will mean all sorts of very, very different things in real communicative terms. So the effects will always be very, very different depending on who is addressed in a particular message, or by means of a particular message. All of this means that, of course, what we see, and also somewhat paradoxically, is that these days, if you want to be a successful politician, you need to spend enormous attention to the way in which you communicate. Not just at the level of what you say, but even more importantly, how you say it, or how you write it, or how you distribute it, and how you select particular audiences, for uptake. And I think that's a very important realization that we now have to, take on board. There is no uniformity anymore in the message in relation to particular audiences. The audiences are widely diverged and apply very different normative systems to that. And so that makes, of course, the analysis of political discourse seriously more difficult, in the sense that what is good or what will work as political discourse is a lot less predictable than it used to be, or at least than we imagined it used to be. Right. But it also means, and here's the good thing, it also means that we need more analysis of political discourse, right? So given the increase in importance of the modes of communication and the enormous complexity that we now see in the field of political discourse, all of this means, in my view, that we need more and more delicate, more specifically developed forms of political discourse analysis as well. And so here's the good news for our profession. We will not go out of business anytime soon. Thank you very much.